Vienna in 1945. How are we to go about it? Rozhkov asked. Red Storm, the Marshal replied simply. Red Storm was the plan for a mechanized attack into West Germany and the Low Countries. Constantly updated for changes in the force structures of both sides, it called for a 2 to 3 week campaign commencing after a rapid escalation of tension between East and West. Despite this, in accordance with standard Soviet strategic doctrine, it called for strategic surprise as a precondition for success, and the use of conventional weapons only. At least they aren't talking about atomic arms, Rozhkov grunted. Other plans with other names applied to different scenarios, including many for the use of tactical and even strategic nuclear arms, something no one in uniform wished to contemplate. Despite all the saber-rattling of their political masters, these professional soldiers knew all too well that the use of nuclear arms made only for ghastly uncertainties. And the Maskirovka? In 2 parts. The first is purely political, to work against the United States.
Copy.
The second part, immediately before the war begins, is from KGB. You know it, from KGB Group Nord. We reviewed it 2 years ago. Rozhkov grunted. Group Nord was an ad hoc committee of KGB department chiefs, first assembled by then-chief of the KGB Yuri Andropov in the mid-1970s. Its purpose was to research means of splitting the NATO alliance, and in general to conduct political and psychological operations aimed at undermining Western will. Its specific plan to shake the NATO military and political structure in preparation for a shooting war was Nord's proudest example of legerdemain. But would it work? The 2 senior officers shared an ironic look. Like most professional soldiers, they distrusted spies and all their plans. 4 months, Rozhkov repeated. We have much to do. And if this KGB magic fails to work, it is a good plan. It need only deceive the West for a week, though 2 weeks would be better. The key, of course, is how quickly NATO can reach full readiness. If we can delay the mobilization process 7 days, victory is assured. And if not, Rozhkov asked sharply, knowing that even a 7-day delay was no guarantee. Then it is not assured, but the balance of forces is on our side. You know that, Yuri. The option of recalling the mobilized forces had never been discussed with the Chief of the General Staff. We will need to improve discipline throughout the force, first of all, Sink Brown said. And I need to inform our senior commanders at once. We need to implement intense training operations. Just how awful is this fuel problem? Shavirin handed his subordinate the notes. It could be worse. We have enough for extended unit training. Your task is no easy one, Yuri, but 4 months is a long time for this task, is it not? It wasn't, but there was no point in saying so.
1-1.
As you say, 4 months to instill fighting discipline. I will have a free hand, within limits. It is one thing to make a private soldier snap to the orders of his sergeant. It might be another for officers conditioned to pushing paper to change into combat leaders. Rozhkov skirted the issue, but his superior received the message clearly enough. A free hand on both, Yuri, but act carefully for both our sakes. Rozhkov nodded briefly. He knew whom he'd use to get this done. With the troops we led 40 years ago, Andrei, we could do this. Rozhkov sat down. And in truth, we have the same raw material now that we had then, and better weapons. The chief unknown remains the men. When we drove our tanks into Vienna, our men were tough, hard veterans. And so were the SS bastards we crushed. Shavirin smiled, remembering. Keep in mind that the same forces are at work in the West, even more so. How well will they fight? Surprised, divided. It can work. We must make it work. I'm meeting with our field commanders Monday. I will tell them myself. Norfolk, Virginia. I hope you take good care of it, the mayor said. It was a moment before Commander Daniel X. McCafferty reacted. USS Chicago had been in commission for only 6 weeks. Her completion delayed by a yard fire, and her commissioning ceremony marred by the absence of the mayor of Chicago due to a strike of city workers. Just back from 5 tough weeks of workups in the Atlantic, his crew was now loading provisions for their first operational deployment. McCafferty was still entranced with his new command and never tired of looking at her. He'd just walked the mayor along the curved upper deck, the first part of any submarine tour, even though there was almost nothing to be seen there. Excuse me? Take good care of our ship, said the mayor of Chicago. We call them boats, sir, and we'll take good care of her for you. Will you join us in the wardroom? More ladders. The mayor pretended to grimace, but McCafferty knew him to be a former fire chief. Would have been useful a few months back, the captain thought. Where are you heading tomorrow? To sea, sir. The captain started down the ladder. The mayor of Chicago followed him. I figured that. For a man in his late 50s, he handled the steel ladder easily enough. They met again at the bottom. What exactly do you do in these things? Sir, the Navy calls it oceanographic research. McCafferty led him forward, turning for a smile with his answer to the awkward question. Things were starting quickly for Chicago. The Navy wanted to see just how effective her new quieting systems were. Everything looked good in the acoustical test range off the Bahamas. Now they wanted to see how well things worked in the Barents Sea. The mayor laughed at that one. Oh, I suppose you'll be counting the whales for Greenpeace. Well, I can say that there are whales where we're heading. What's with the tile on your deck? I never heard of rubber decks on a ship. It's called anechoic tile, sir. The rubber absorbs sound waves. It makes us quieter to operate and makes it harder to detect us on sonar if somebody pings at us.
Request taxi to runway.
Coffee? You'd think that on a day like this. The captain chuckled.
Clear to taxi
Me
to
too.
runway 17.
But it's against regulations. The mayor hoisted his cup and clicked against McCafferty's. Luck? I'll drink to that. Moscow, RSFSR. They met at the main officers' club of the Moscow Military District on Ulitsa Krasno-Kazarmanaya, a massively impressive building dating back to Tsarist times. It was the normal time of year for senior field commanders to confer in Moscow, and such events were always punctuated by elaborate ceremonial dinners. Roscoff greeted his fellow officers at the main entrance, and when all were assembled, he led them downstairs to the ornate steam baths. Present were all theater commanders, each accompanied by his deputy, his Air Force commander, and the fleet commanders. A small galaxy of stars, ribbons, and braid. 10 minutes later, naked but for a pair of towels and a handful of birch branches each, they were just another group of middle-aged men, perhaps a bit fitter than was the average in the Soviet Union. They all knew one another. Though many were rivals, they were members of the same profession nevertheless. And with an intimacy characteristic of the Russian steam baths, they exchanged small talk for several minutes. Several of them were grandfathers now, and spoke with animation about the continuation of their lines. Regardless of personal rivalries, it was expected that senior officers would look out for the careers of their comrades' sons. And so information was briefly exchanged on whose son was in which command and wanted advancement to what new posting. Finally came the classically Russian dispute over the strength of the steam. Roscoff peremptorily settled the argument with a thin but steady stream of cold water onto the heated bricks in the center of the room.
Request rearming.
The resulting hiss would be sufficient to interfere with any listening devices in the room, if the foggy air hadn't already corroded them to junk. Roscoff had not given the first hint of what was happening. Better, he thought, to shock them into the situation and get candid reactions to the situation at hand. Comrades, I must make an announcement. Conversation stilled, and the men looked inquiringly in his direction. Here we go. Comrades, on 15 June of this year, just 4 months from now,
Rearming complete.
we launch an offensive against NATO. For a moment, only the hiss of the steam could be heard. Then 3 men laughed, having imbibed a few stiff drinks in the sanctity of their staff cars on the drive over from the Kremlin. Those close enough to see Sink Ground's face did not. You are serious, Comrade Marshall? Asked the Commander-in-Chief of the Western Theater. Receiving a nod in reply, he said, "Then perhaps you would be so kind as to explain the reason for this action."
Flight controls.
Of course.
Flight controls.
You are all aware of the Nizhnevertovsk oil field disaster. What you have not yet learned are its strategic and political implications. It took 6 brisk minutes to outline everything the Politburo had decided. In just over 4 months from now, we shall launch the most crucial military operation in the history of the Soviet Union. The destruction of NATO as a political and military force. And we will succeed. Finished, he stared at the officer in silence. The steam was having its desired effects on the assembly of flag officers. Its searing heat assaulted their breathing passages, sobering those who had been drinking. And it made them sweat. They'd be doing a lot of that in the next few months, Roscoff thought. Then Pavel Alexeyev, deputy commander of the Southwestern Theater, spoke. I heard rumors, he said, but that bad? Yes. We have sufficient POL supplies for 12 months of normal operations, or enough for 60 days of war operations after a brief period of increased training activity. At the cost, he didn't say, of crippling the national economy by mid-August. Alexeyev leaned forward and swatted himself with his bundle of branches. The action was strangely like a lion's swishing its tail. At 50, he was the second youngest officer there, a respected intellectual soldier and a fit, handsome man with the shoulders of a lumberjack. His intense, dark eyes squinted down through the rising cloud of steam. Mid-June? Yes, Roscoff said. We have that long to prepare our plans and our troops. Sink Ground looked around the room. Already the ceiling had become partially obscured by a mist. I presume we are here so that we may speak frankly among ourselves, no? This is so, Pavel Leonidovich, Roscoff replied, not the least surprised that Alexeyev had been the first to speak. Sink Ground had carefully advanced the man's career over the last decade. He was the only son of a hard-charging tank general of the Great Motherland War, one of the many good men pensioned off during the bloodless purges under Nikita Khrushchev in the late 1950s. Comrades, Alexeyev stood, climbing slowly down the benches to the marble floor. I accept everything Marshal Roscoff has told us, but 4 months. 4 months in which we may be detected. 4 months in which we may lose all the element of surprise. Then what may happen? No, we have a plan all ready for this. Zhukov 4. Instant mobilization. We can all be back to our command posts in 6 hours. If we are going to conduct a surprise attack, then let us make it one no one can detect in time. 72 hours from now. Again, the only sound in the room was that of the water flashing to steam on the dun-colored bricks. Then the room erupted with noise. Zhukov 4 was the winter variant of a plan which hypothesized discovery of NATO's intention to launch a surprise attack of its own on the Warsaw Pact. In such a case, Standard Soviet military doctrine was the same as anyone else's.
Request startup.
The best defense is a good offense. Preempt the NATO armies by attacking at once with the Category A mechanized divisions in East Germany.
Meters per second.
But we are not ready, objected Sinquest. His was the Point Command with
Request
headquarters
taxi
in
to
Berlin,
runway.
the single most powerful military command in the world. An attack into West Germany was primarily his responsibility. Alexeyev held up his hands. Neither are they. In fact, they are less ready than we, he said reasonably. Look, consider our intelligence data. 14% of their officers are on holidays. They are coming off a training cycle, true, but because of it, much of their equipment will be down for maintenance. And many of their senior officers will be away in their respective capitals for consultations, just as we are now. Their troops are in winter quarters on a winter routine. This is the time of year for maintenance and paperwork. Physical training is curtailed. Who wants to run in the snow, eh?
1-1. Request
Their men are
taxi to
cold and
runway.
drinking more than usual. This is our time to act. We all know that historically the Soviet fighting man performs at his best in winter, and NATO is at its lowest state of readiness. But so are we, you young fool,
Request takeoff.
Sink Western Theater growled back. We can change that in 48 hours, Alexeyev countered. Impossible, observed West's deputy, careful to back up his boss. To reach our maximum readiness will take some months, Alexeyev agreed. His only chance to carry his point with his seniors was to reason with them. He knew that he was almost certainly doomed to failure, but he had to try. It will be difficult, if not impossible, for us to conceal it. As Marshal Roshkov told us, Pavel Leonidovich, we are promised political and diplomatic maskirovka, a general pointed out. I have no doubt that our comrades in the KGB and our skillful political leadership will perform miracles. The room just might have functioning bugs after all. But is it not asking too much to expect that the imperialists, as much as they fear and hate us, as active as their agents and spy satellites are, will fail to note a doubling of our training activity? We know that NATO increases its readiness when we go into major unit training, and their preparedness will automatically be increased by their own spring training cycles. If we continue our training beyond the normal pattern, they will be even more alert. Achieving full combat readiness requires that we do too many things out of the ordinary. If nothing else, East Germany is rife with Western spies. NATO will notice. NATO will react. They will meet us on the border with everything in their collective arsenals. If, on the other hand, we attack with what we have, now, we have the advantage. Our men are not off skiing in the fucking Alps. Zhukov 4 is designed to cycle from peace to war in 48 hours. There is no way possible for NATO to react in so little time. They'll take 48 hours to get their intelligence information organized and presented to their ministers. By that time, our shells will be falling on the Fulda Gap, and our tanks will be advancing behind them. Too many things can go wrong. Sink West rose so swiftly that the towel nearly came off his waist. His left hand grabbed downward, while his right fist shook at the younger man. What about traffic control? What about training our men in their new battle equipment? What about getting my frontal aviation pilots ready for combat operations against the imperialists? There, right there is an insurmountable problem. Our pilots need at least a month of intensive training. And so do my tankers, and so do my gunners, and so do my riflemen. If you knew your job, they would be ready now, you worthless, whore-chasing son of a bitch, Alexeyev thought, but did not dare to say aloud. Sinkwest was a man of 61 who liked to demonstrate his manly prowess, boasted of it, to the detriment of his professional duties. Alexeyev had heard that story often enough, whispered jovially in this very room. But Sinkwest was politically reliable.
Overlord 1-1.
Such is the Soviet system, the younger general reflected. We need fighting soldiers, and what do we get with which to defend the Rodina? Political reliability. He remembered bitterly what had happened to his father in 1958. But Alexeyev did not allow himself to begrudge the party its control of the armed forces. The party was the state, after all, and he was a sworn servant of the state. He had learned these truisms at his father's knee. One more card to play. Comrade General, you have good officers commanding your divisions, regiments, and battalions. Trust them to know their duties. It couldn't hurt to waive the standards of the Red Army, Alexeyev reasoned. Roscoff stood, and everyone in the room strained to hear his pronouncement. What you say has merit, Pavel Leonidovich, but do we gamble with the safety of the motherland? He shook his head, quoting doctrine exactly, as he had been doing for too many years. No. We rely on surprise, yes. On the first weighted blow to blast open a path for the daring thrust of our mechanized forces. And we will have our supplies. The Westerners will not wish to believe what is happening. And with the Politburo soothing them even as we prepare the first blow, we will have our strategic surprise. The West will have perhaps 3 days, 4 at most, to know what is coming. And even then they will not be mentally prepared for us. The officers followed Roscoff from the room to rinse the sweat from their bodies with cold water showers. 10 minutes later, refreshed, dressed in full uniform, the officers reassembled in a second-floor banquet room. The waiters, many of them KGB informers, noted the subdued mood and quiet conversations that frustrated their efforts to listen in. The generals knew that KGB's Lefortovo prison was a bare kilometer away. Our plans? Sink southwest, asked his deputy. How many times have we played this war game? Alexeyev responded. All the maps and formulae we have examined for years. We know the troop and tank concentrations. We know the routes, the highways, crossroads that we must use, and those that NATO will use. We know our mobilization schedules and theirs. The only thing we don't know is whether our carefully laid plans will in fact work. We should attack at once. Then the unknowns will work against both sides equally. And if our attack goes too well, and NATO relies on a nuclear defense, the senior officer asked. Alexeyev acknowledged the importance and grave unpredictability of the point. They might do that anyway. Comrade, all of our plans depend heavily on surprise, no? A mixture of surprise and success will force the West to consider nuclear weapons. Here you are wrong, my young friend. Sink Southwest chided. The decision to use nuclear weapons is political. To prevent their use is also a political exercise for which time is required. But if we wait over 4 months, how can we be assured of strategic surprise? Alexeyev demanded. Our political leadership has promised it. The year I entered Frunze Academy, the party told us the date on which we would surely have true communism in our lifetime. A solemn promise. That date was 6 years ago. Such talk is safe with me, Pasha. I understand you. But if you do not learn to control your tongue, forgive me, Comrade General. We must allow for the chance that surprise will not be achieved. In combat, despite the most careful preparations, risks cannot be avoided. Alexeyev quoted from the syllabus of the Frunze Academy. Attention must therefore be given, and the most detailed plans prepared for every reasonable exigency of the overall operation. For this reason, the unsung life of a staff officer is among the most demanding of those honored to serve the state. You have the memory of a kulak, Pasha. Sink Southwest laughed, filling his deputy's glass with Georgian wine. But you are correct. Failure to achieve surprise means that we are forcing a campaign of attrition on a vast scale, a high-technology version of the 1418 war. Which we will win. Sinkground sat down next to Alexeyev. Which we will win, Alexeyev agreed. All Soviet generals accepted the premise that the inability to force a rapid decision would force a bloody war of attrition that would grind each side down equally. The Soviets had far more reserves of men and material with which to fight such a war, and the political will to use them. If and only if we are able to force the pace of battle, and if our friends in the Navy can prevent the resupply of NATO from America. NATO has war stocks of materiel to sustain them for roughly 5 weeks. Our pretty expensive fleet must close the Atlantic. Maslov. Rashkov beckoned to the commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy. We wish to hear your opinion of the correlation of forces in the North Atlantic. Our mission? Maslov asked warily. If we fail to achieve surprise in the West, Andrei Petrovich, it will be necessary for our beloved comrades in the Navy to isolate Europe from America, Rashkov pronounced. He blinked hard at the response. Give me a division of airborne troops and I can fulfill that task, Maslov responded soberly. He held a glass of mineral water and had been careful to avoid drink on this cold February night. The question is whether our strategic stance at sea should be offensive or defensive. The NATO navies, above all the United States Navy, is a direct threat to the Rodina. It alone has the aircraft and aircraft carriers with which to attack the homeland at the Kola Peninsula. In fact, we know that they have plans to do exactly that. So what? Sink Southwest observed. No attack on Soviet soil is to be taken lightly, of course, but we will take severe losses in this campaign no matter how brilliantly we fight it. What matters is the final outcome. If the Americans succeed in attacking Kola, they effectively prevent our closure of the North Atlantic. And you are wrong to shrug off these attacks. American entry into the Barents Sea will constitute a direct threat to our nuclear deterrent forces, and could have more dire consequences than you imagine. Admiral Maslov leaned forward. On the other hand, if you persuade Stavka to give us the resources to execute Operation Polar Glory, we can seize the combat initiative and dictate the nature of operations in the North Atlantic on our chosen terms. He held up a closed fist. By doing this, we can first, he raised a finger, prevent an American naval attack against the Rodina. Second, another finger, use the majority of our submarine forces in the North Atlantic basin where the trade routes are, instead of keeping them on passive defense. And third, a final finger, make maximum use of our naval aviation assets. At one stroke, this operation makes our fleet an offensive rather than a defensive weapon. And to accomplish this, you need only one of our Guards' air rifle divisions? Outline your plan for us, please, Comrade Admiral, Alexeyev said. Maslov did so over a period of 5 minutes. He concluded, with luck, we will with one blow give the NATO navies more than they can deal with, and leave us with a valuable position for post-war exploitation. Better to draw their carrier forces in and destroy them. Sinkwest joined the discussion. Maslov responded. The Americans will have 5 or 6 carriers available to use against us in the Atlantic. Each one carries 58 aircraft that can be used in an air superiority or nuclear strike role, aside from those used for fleet defense. I submit, comrade, that it is in our interest to keep those ships as far from the Rodina as possible. Andrei Petrovich, I am impressed, Rashkov said thoughtfully, noting the respect in Alexeyev's eyes as well. Polar Glory was both bold and simple. I want a full briefing on this plan tomorrow afternoon. You say that if we can allocate the resources, success in this venture is highly probable. We have worked on this plan for 5 years, with particular emphasis on simplicity. If security can be maintained, only 2 things need go right for success to be achieved. Rashkov nodded. Then you will have my support. Chapter 4. Maskirovka 1. Moscow, RSFSR. The foreign minister entered stage left, as he always did, and walked to the lectern with a brisk step that belied his 60 years. Before him was a mob of reporters arrayed by the Soviet guards into their respective groups, the print press grasping at their pads and backed up by their photographers, the visual media arrayed in front of their portable Klieg lights. The foreign minister hated the damn things, hated the people in front of them. The Western press, with its lack of manners, always prying, always probing, always demanding answers that he need not give to his own people. How odd, he thought, while looking up from his notes, that he often had to speak more openly to these paid foreign spies than to members of the party's Central Committee. Spies. Exactly what they were. They could be manipulated, of course, by a skilled man with a collection of carefully prepared disinformation, which was precisely what he was about to do. But on the whole, they were a threat because they never stopped doing what it was they did. It was something the foreign minister never allowed himself to forget, and the reason he did not hold them in contempt. Dealing with them always held potential danger. Even while being manipulated, they could be dangerous in their quest for information. If only the rest of the Politburo understood. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, speaking in English, "I will be making a brief statement, and I regret that I cannot answer any questions at this time. A full handout will be given to everyone as you leave. That is, I think they are ready by now." He gestured to a man at the back of the room, who nodded emphatically. The foreign minister arranged his papers one more time and began to speak with the precise diction for which he was known. "The President of the United States has often asked for deeds, not words, in the quest for control of strategic arms. As you know, and to the disappointment of the entire world, the ongoing arms negotiations in Vienna have made no significant progress for over a year, with each side blaming the other for the lack of it. It is well known by peace-loving people the world over that the Soviet Union has never wished for war, and that only a madman would even consider nuclear war a viable policy option in our modern world of overkill, fallout, and nuclear winter." "Damn," muttered AP Bureau Chief Patrick Flynn. The Soviets scarcely acknowledged nuclear winter, and had never mentioned the concept in so formal a setting. His antennae were already twitching at whatever there was in the wind. "The time has come for substantive reductions in strategic arms. We have made numerous, serious, sincere proposals for real arms reductions. And despite this, the United States has proceeded with the development and deployment of its destabilizing, openly offensive weapons.
Flight controls.
The MX First Strike Missile, so cynically called the Peacekeeper. The Advanced Trident D5 First Strike Sea-Launched Ballistic Missile. Two separate varieties of cruise missiles, whose characteristics conspire to make arms control verification almost totally impossible. And, of course, the so-called Strategic Defense Initiative, which will take offensive strategic weapons into space.
1-1, inbound.
Such are America's deeds." He looked up from his notes and spoke with irony. "And through it all, America's pious words demand Soviet deeds. Starting tomorrow, we will see once and for all if America's words are to be believed or not. Starting tomorrow, we will see how great a difference there is between America's words about peace and Soviet deeds for peace. Tomorrow, the Soviet Union will put on the table at Vienna a proposal to reduce existing arsenals of strategic and theater nuclear weapons by 50%. This reduction to be accomplished over a period of 3 years from ratification of the agreement, subject to on-site verification conducted by third-party inspection teams whose composition will be agreed upon by all signatories. Please note that I say all signatories. The Soviet Union invites the United Kingdom, the French Republic, and, he looked up, the People's Republic of China to join us at the negotiating table. The explosion of flashbulbs caused him to look away for a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, please. He smiled, holding his hand up to shield his face. These old eyes are not up to such abuse as this, and I have not memorized my speech, unless you want me to continue in Russian. There was a wave of laughter, then a sprinkling of applause at the jibe. The old bastard was really turning on the charm, Flynn thought, furiously taking notes. This was potential dynamite. He wondered what would come next, and he especially wondered what the precise wording on the proposal was. Flynn had covered arms talks before, and knew all too well that general descriptions of proposals could grossly distort the nuts and bolts details of the real issues to be negotiated. The Russians couldn't be this open. They just couldn't be. To proceed. The foreign minister blinked his eyes clear. We have been accused of never making a gesture of our good faith. The falsehood of the charge is manifest, but this evil fiction continues in the West. No longer will anyone have cause to doubt the sincerity of the Soviet people's quest for a just and lasting peace. Beginning today, as a sign of good faith, which we challenge the United States and any other interested nation to match, the Soviet Union will remove from service an entire class of nuclear-powered missile submarine. These submarines are known to the West as the Yankee class. We call them something else, of course, he said with an ingenuous grin that drew another wave of polite laughter.
Request refueling.
20 of the vessels are presently in service, each carrying 12 sea-launched ballistic missiles. All active members of the class are assigned to the Soviet Northern Fleet based on the Kola Peninsula. Beginning today, we will deactivate these vessels at a rate of 1 per month. As you know, complete deactivation of so complex a machine as a missile submarine requires the services of a shipyard. The missile compartment must be physically removed from the body of the vessel. And so these vessels cannot be fully disarmed overnight. However, to make the honesty of our intentions undeniable, we invite the United States to do one of two things. First, we will permit a selected team of 6 American naval officers to inspect these 20 vessels to verify that their missile tubes have been filled with concrete ballast, pending removal of the entire missile rooms from all of the submarines. In return for this, we would require that a comparable inspection visit by an equal number of Soviet officers to American yards would be allowed at a later date to be agreed on. Second, as an alternative, should the United States be unwilling to allow reciprocal verification of arms reductions, we will permit another group of 6 officers to perform this service. These officers to be from a country or countries upon which the United States and the Soviet Union can agree within the next 30 days. A team from such neutral countries as Sweden or India would be acceptable in principle to the Soviet Union. Ladies and gentlemen, the time has come to put an end to the arms race. I will not repeat all of the flowery rhetoric we've all heard over the past 2 generations. We all know the threat that these ghastly weapons represent to every nation. Let no one ever say again that the government of the Soviet Union has not done its part to reduce the danger of war. Thank you. The room suddenly fell silent but for the sound of motor-driven still cameras. The Western press representatives assigned to their respective Moscow bureaus were among the best in their profession. Uniformly bright, uniformly ambitious, uniformly cynical about what they found in Moscow and the conditions under which they were forced to work, all were stunned to silence. God damn, muttered Flynn after a full 10 seconds. One must admire your understatement, old boy, agreed Reuters correspondent William Calloway. Wasn't it your Wilson who spoke of open covenants openly arrived at? Yeah, my granddad covered that peace conference. Remember how well it worked out? Flynn grimaced, watching the foreign minister depart, smiling at the cameras. I want to see the handout. Want to ride back with me? Yes, on both. It was a bitterly cold day in Moscow. Snow piles were heaped at the roadsides. The sky was a frigid crystal blue. And the car's heater didn't work. Flynn drove while his friend read aloud through the handout. The draft treaty proposal took up 19 annotated pages. The Reuters correspondent was a Londoner who had begun as a police reporter, and since covered assignments all over the world. He and Flynn had met many years before at the famous Caravel Hotel in Saigon, and shared drinks and typewriter ribbons on and off for more than 2 decades. In the face of a Russian winter, they remembered the oppressive heat of Saigon with something akin to nostalgia. It's bloody fair, Calloway said wonderingly, his breath giving ghostly substance to his words. They propose a build-down with elimination of many existing weapons, allowing both sides to replace obsolete launchers, both sides to reach a total of 5,000 deliverable warheads, that number to remain stable for 5 years after the 3-year reduction period. There is a separate proposal to negotiate complete removal of heavy missiles, replacing them with mobile missiles, but to limit missile flight tests to a fixed number per year. He flipped that page and rapidly scanned the remainder. Nothing in the draft treaty about your Star Wars research? Didn't he mention that in his statement? Patrick, old son, this is, as you say, dynamite. This could as easily have been written in Washington. It will take months to work out all the technical points, but this is a bloody serious and bloody generous proposal. Nothing about Star Wars? Flynn frowned briefly as he turned right. Did that mean that the Russians had made a breakthrough of their own? Have to query Washington about that. We got us a story here, Willie. What's your lead? How's peace grab you? Calloway just laughed at that. Fort Meade, Maryland. American intelligence agencies, like their counterparts throughout the world, monitor all news wire services. Toland was examining the AP and Reuters reports before most news bureau chiefs, and comparing them with the version transmitted over Soviet microwave circuits for publication in the regional editions of Pravda and Izvestia. The way items of hard news were reported in the Soviet Union was intended to show party members how their leaders felt. We've been down this road before, his section chief said. The last time things broke down on this issue of mobile missiles. Both sides want them, but both sides are afraid of the other side having them. But the tone of the report. They're always euphoric about their arms control proposals, damn it. Hell, Bob, you know that. True, sir, but it's the first time that I know of that the Russians have unilaterally removed a weapons platform from service. The Yankees are obsolete. So what? They never throw anything away, obsolete or not. They still have World War II artillery pieces sitting in warehouses in case they need them again. This is different. And the political ramifications... We're not talking politics, we're talking nuclear strategy, the section chief growled back. As if there were a difference, Toland said to himself. Kiev, the Ukraine. Well, Pasha? Comrade General, we truly have a man's work before us, Alexeyev answered, standing at attention in the Kiev headquarters of the Southwest Theater. Our troops need extensive unit training. Over the weekend, I read through more than 80 regimental readiness reports from our tank and motor rifle divisions. Alexeyev paused before going on. Tactical training and readiness was the bane of the Soviet military. Their troops were almost entirely conscripts, in and out in 2 years, half of whose uniformed service was occupied just in acquiring basic military skills. Even the non-coms, the backbone of every army since the Roman legions, were conscripts selected for special training academies. then lost as soon as their enlistment periods ended. For that reason, the Soviet military leaned heavily on its officers, who often performed what in the West was sergeant's work. The professional officer corps of the Soviet Army was its only permanent, only dependable feature. In theory. The truth of the matter is that we don't know our readiness posture at the moment. Our colonels all use the same language in their reports, without the slightest deviation. Everyone reports meeting norms, with the same amount of training hours, the same amount of political indoctrination, the same number of practice shots fired. That is a deviation of under 3%. And the requisite number of field exercises run, all, of course, of the proper type. As prescribed in our training manuals, the Colonel General noted. Naturally. Exactly. Too damned exactly. No deviation for adverse weather. No deviation for late fuel deliveries. No deviation for anything at all. For example, the 703rd Motor Rifle Regiment spent all of last October on harvesting duty south of Kharkov. Yet, somehow, they met their monthly norms for unit training at the same time. Lies are bad enough, but these are stupid lies. It cannot be as bad as you fear, Pavel Leonidovich. Do we dare to assume otherwise, comrade? The general stared down at his desk. No. Very well, Pasha. You formulated your plan. Let me hear it. For the moment, you will be outlining the plan for our attack into the Muslim lands. I must get into the field to whip our field commanders into shape. If we wish to accomplish our goals in time for the attack west, we must make an example of the worst offenders. I have 4 commanders in mind. Their conduct has been grossly and undeniably criminal. Here are the names and charges. He handed over a single sheet of paper. There are 2 good men here, Pasha, the general objected. They are guardians of the state. They enjoy positions of the greatest trust. They have betrayed that trust by lying, and in doing so they have endangered the state, Alexeyev said. Wondering how many men in his country could have that said of them, he dismissed the thought. There were problems enough right here. You understand the consequences of the charges you bring? Of course. The penalty for treason is death. Did I ever falsify a readiness report? Did you? Alexeyev looked away briefly. It is a hard thing, and I take no pleasure in it. But unless we snap our units into shape, how many young boys will die for their officers' failings? We need combat readiness more than we need 4 liars. If there is a gentler way to achieve this, I don't know what that might be. An army without discipline is a worthless mob. We have the directive from Stavka to make examples of unruly privates and restore the authority of our NCOs. It is fitting that if privates must suffer for their failings, then their colonels must suffer too. Theirs is the greater responsibility. Theirs is the greater reward. A few examples here will go a long way to restoring our army. The inspectorate? The best choice, Alexeyev agreed. That way, blame would not necessarily be traced back to the senior commanders themselves. I can send teams from the Inspector General's service out to these regiments day after tomorrow. Our training memoranda arrived in all divisional and regimental headquarters this morning. The news of these 4 traitors will encourage our unit commanders to implement them with vigor. Even then, it will be 2 weeks before we have a clear picture of what we need to focus on. But once we can identify the areas that need buttressing, we should have ample time to accomplish what we need to accomplish. What will Sink West be doing? The same, one hopes. Alexeyev shook his head. Has he asked for any of our units yet? No, but he will. We will not be ordered to launch offensive operations against NATO's southern flank, part of the continuing Maskirovka. You may assume that many of our Category B units will be detailed to Germany, possibly some of our A tank forces also. However many divisions that fool has, he'll want more. Just so we have enough troops to seize the oil fields when the time comes, Pasha observed. Which plan are we supposed to execute? The old one. We'll have to update it, of course. The old plan predated Soviet involvement in Afghanistan. And now the Red Army had a whole new perspective on sending mechanized forces into an area occupied by armed Muslims. Alexeyev's hands bunched into fists. Marvelous. We must formulate a plan without knowing when it will be implemented or what forces we'll have available to execute it. Remember what you told me about the life of a staff officer, Pasha? Sink Southwest chuckled. The younger man nodded ruefully, hoist on his own petard. Indeed, Comrade General. We will do our sleeping after the war. Chapter 5. Sailors and Spooks. The Chesapeake Bay, Maryland. His eyes squinted painfully at the horizon. The sun was only half a diameter above the green-brown line of Maryland's eastern shore. A reminder, if he needed one, that he'd worked late the day before, gone to bed later still, then arisen at 4:30 so that he could get in a day's fishing. A slowly receding sinus-like headache also let him know about the 6-pack of beer he'd consumed in front of the TV. But it was his first fishing day of the year, and the casting rod felt good in his hand as he gave it a gentle swing toward a ripple on the calm surface of the Chesapeake Bay. A blue or a rockfish? Whatever it was, it didn't nibble at his bucktail lure. But there was no hurry. Coffee, Bob? Thanks, Pop. Robert Toland set his rod in its holder and leaned back into the midship's swivel chair of his Boston whaler Outrage. His father-in-law, Edward Keegan, held out the plastic cup cap from a large thermos jug. Bob knew the coffee would be good. Ned Keegan was a former naval officer who appreciated a good cup, preferably flavored with brandy or Irish whiskey. Something to open the eyes and put a fire in the belly. Cold or not, damn if it ain't nice to get out here. Keegan sipped at his cup, resting one foot on the bait box. It wasn't just the fishing, both men agreed. Getting out on the water was one sure cure for civilization. Be nice if the Rock really are coming back too, Toland observed. What the hell? No phones? What about your beeper? I must have left it with my other pants, Keegan chuckled. DIA will have to manage without me today. Think they can? Well, the Navy did. Keegan was an academy graduate who had put in his 30 and retired to become a double-dipper. In uniform, he'd been an intelligence specialist, and now he had essentially the same job, which added civil service salary to his pension. Toland had been a lieutenant, JG, serving aboard a destroyer based at Pearl Harbor when he'd first noticed Martha Keegan, a junior at the University of Hawaii, majoring in psychology and minoring in surgery. They'd been happily married for 15 years now. So, Keegan stood and lifted his rod. How are things at the fort? Bob Toland was a middle-level analyst at the National Security Agency. He'd left the Navy after 6 years when the adventure of uniformed service had palled. But he remained an active reservist. His work at NSA dovetailed nicely with his Naval Reserve Service. A communications expert with a degree in electronics, his current job was monitoring Soviet signals gathered by the NSA's numerous listening posts and Farad satellites. Along the way, he'd also gotten a master's in the Russian language. Heard something real interesting last week, but I couldn't convince my boss it meant anything. Who's your section chief? Captain Albert Redman, U.S. Navy. Toland watched a bay-built fishing boat motoring a few miles away, her captain laying out his crab pots. He's an asshole. Keegan laughed. You want to be careful saying stuff like that out loud, Bob. Especially seeing how you go on active duty next week. Burke worked with me, Oh, must have been 15 years ago. I had to slap him down a few times. He does tend to be slightly opinionated. That bastard's so friggin' narrow-minded and scratch pads are only an inch wide. First there was this new arm whistle. Then I came up with something really unusual last Wednesday, and he circular filed it. Hell, I don't know why he even bothers looking at new data. He made up his mind 5 years ago. I don't suppose you could tell me what it was? I shouldn't. Bob wavered for a moment. Hell, if he couldn't talk with his kid's own grandfather. One of our ferret birds was over a Soviet military district headquarters last week and intercepted a microwaved telephone conversation. It was a report to Moscow about 4 colonels in the Carpathian military district who were being shot for gun-decking readiness reports. The story on their court-martial and execution was being set up for publication, probably in a Red Star this week. He had entirely forgotten about the oil field fire. Oh? Keegan's eyebrows went up. And what did Bert say? He said, it's goddamned about time they cleaned their act up. And that was that. And what do you say? Pop, I'm not in trends and intentions. Those idiot fortune tellers. But I know that even the Russians don't kill people for jollies. When Ivan kills people publicly, he does it to make a point. These were not manpower officers taking bribes to fake deferments. They weren't popped for stealing diesel fuel or building dachas with pilfered lumber. I checked our records, and it turned out we have files on 2 of them. They were both experienced line officers, both with combat experience in Afghanistan, both party members in good standing. One was a graduate of Frunze Academy, and he even had a few articles published in Military Thought, for God's sake. But all 4 were court-martialed for falsifying their regimental readiness reports, and shot 3 days later. That story will hit the streets in Krasnaya Zvezda over the next few days as a 2- or 3-part story under the Observer's byline. And that makes it a political exercise with a capital P. The Observer was the cover name for any number of high-ranking officers who contributed to Red Star, the daily newspaper of the Soviet Armed Services. Anything on the front page and under that byline was taken quite seriously, both in the Soviet military services and by those whose job it was to watch them. Because this byline was used explicitly to make policy statements approved by both the military high command and the Politburo in Moscow. A multi-part story? Keegan asked. Yeah, that's one of the interesting things about it. The repetition means they really want this lesson to sink in. Everything about this is out of pattern, Pop. Something funny is happening. They do shoot officers and EMs, but not full colonels who've written for the Journal of the General Staff, and not for faking a few lines in a readiness statement. He let out a long breath, happy to have gotten this off his chest. The workboat was proceeding south, her wake rippling out toward them in parallel lines on the mirrored surface. The image made Toland wish for his camera. Makes sense, Keegan mumbled. Huh? What you just said? That does sound out of pattern. Yep. I stayed in late last night, running down a hunch. In the past 5 years, the Red Army has published the names of exactly 14 executed officers, none higher than a full colonel. And even then, only one, a manpower officer in Soviet Georgia. The guy was taking payoffs for deferments. The others broke down into 1 case of spying, for us or somebody, 3 derelictions of duty while under the influence of alcohol, and 9 conventional corruption cases, selling everything from gasoline to a whole mainframe computer, Nalyevo, on the left, the shadow market. Now, all of a sudden, they waste 4 regimental commanders, all in the same military district. You could take that to Redmond, Keegan suggested. Waste of time. Those other cases, I seem to remember the 3 guys who... Yeah, that was part of the temperance campaign. Too many guys turn up drunk on duty, and they pick 3 volunteers pour encourager les autres. Bob shook his head. Geez, Voltaire would have loved these guys. You talk with people who are into civilian intelligence? No, my crowd is all military telecommunications. At lunch last Monday, I think, I was talking with a guy from Langley. Ex-Army, we go way back. Anyway, he was joking that there's a new shortage over there. Another one? Bob was amused. Shortages were nothing new in Russia. 1 month, toothpaste, or toilet paper, or windshield wipers. He had heard of many such things over lunch at the NSA commissary. Yeah, car and truck batteries. Really? Yeah, for the last month you can't get a battery for your car or truck over there. A lot of cars are not moving, and batteries are being stolen left and right. So people are disconnecting their batteries at night and taking them home, would you believe? But Toliadistat, Toland said, and stopped. He referred to the massive auto factory city in European Russia, the construction of which was a hero project for which thousands of workers had been mobilized. Among the most modern auto complexes in the world, it had been built mainly with Italian technology. They have a hell of a battery manufacturing facility there. Hasn't blown up, has it? Working 3 shifts. What do you think of that? Norfolk, Virginia. Toland examined himself in the full-sized mirror in the Norfolk BOQ complex. He'd made the drive down the evening before. The uniform still fit, he noted. Maybe a little tight at the waist, but that was nature at work, wasn't it? His solid bar of decorations was a bleak row and a half, but he had his surface warfare officer's badge, his water wings. He hadn't always been a glorified radio operator. His sleeves bore the 2.5 stripes of a lieutenant commander. A final swipe of a cloth across his shoes, and he was out the door, ready on this bright Monday morning for his annual 2 weeks of duty with the fleet. 5 minutes later, he was driving down Mitcher Avenue toward headquarters of the Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet, Sinklant Fleet, a flat, thoroughly undistinguished building that had once been a hospital. An habitual early riser, Toland found the Ingersoll Street parking lot half empty. But he was still careful to take an unmarked space lest he incur the wrath of a senior officer. Bob? Bob Toland, a voice called. Ed Morris. It was now Commander Edward Morris, USN, Toland noted, and a shiny gold star on his uniform jacket designated him as the commander of some ship or other. Toland saluted his friend before shaking hands. Still playing bridge, Bob? Toland, Morris, and 2 other officers had once established the most regular bridge foursome at the Pearl Harbor Officers Club. Some. Marty isn't much of a card player, but we got a bunch at work that meets once a week. Good as we used to be? Morris asked, as they headed off in the same direction. Are you kidding? You know where I work now? I heard you ended up at Fort Meade after you hung it up. Yeah, and there's bridge players at NSA who are wired into the damn computers. I'm talking assassins. So, how's the family? Just great. How's yours? Growing up too damn fast. Makes you feel old. That's the truth, Toland chuckled. He jabbed a finger at his friend's star. Now you can tell me about your new kid. Look at my car. Toland turned around. Morris's Ford had a personalized license plate, FF 1094. To the uninitiated, it was an ordinary license number. But to a sailor, it advertised his command. Anti-submarine frigate number 1094, USS Ferris. You always were nice and modest, Toland noted with a grin. That's all right, Ed. How long you had her? 2 years. She's big, she's pretty, and she's mine. You should have stayed in, Bob. The day I took command, hell, it was like the day Jimmy was born. I hear you. The difference, Ed, is that I always knew you'd have your ship, and I always knew I wouldn't. In Toland's personnel jacket, was a letter of admonishment for grounding a destroyer while he had the deck. It had been no more than bad luck. An ambiguity on the chart and adverse tidal conditions had caused the error, but it didn't take much to ruin a Navy career. So, doing your 2 weeks? That's right. Celia is off visiting her parents, and I'm batching it. What are you doing for dinner tonight? McDonald's? Toland laughed. Like hell. Danny McCafferty's in town, too. He's got the Chicago tied up at Pier 22. You know, if we can scare up a fourth, maybe we can play a little bridge, just like the old days. Morris poked his friend in the chest. I gotta head along. Meet me in the Oak Club lobby at 17:30, Bob. Danny invited me over to his boat for dinner at 18:30, and we'll have an hour's worth of attitude adjustment before we drive over. We'll have dinner in the wardroom and a few hours of cards, just like old times. Aye, aye, Commander. Anyway, there I was on Will Rogers, McCafferty said. 50 days out on patrol, and I got the watch, right? Sonar says they have a goofy signal bearing 052. We're at periscope depth, so I put the search scope up, train it out to 052, and sure enough, there's this Gulfstream 36 sailboat, moving along at 4 or 5 knots with the auto steering rig set. What the hell, it's a dull day, so I flipped the scope to high power. And guess what? The captain and the mate, there's one gal who'll never drown, are on top of the deck house, horizontal and superimposed. The boat was maybe 1,000 yards away, just like being there. So we turn on the scope TV camera and get the tape machine running. Had to maneuver for a better view, of course. Lasted 15 minutes. The crew ran the tape for the next week. Great for morale to know just what you're fighting for. All 3 officers laughed. Like I always told you, Bob, Morris noted, these sub-drivers are a nasty, sneaky bunch.